Check page 47, David Morrison whispered urgently to CEO Alexandra Sterling as she raised a golden Mont Blanc pen worth more than his monthly rent above the $8 billion merger contract that would either secure her pharmaceutical empire or authorize her murder within 90 days. His voice barely audible over the champagne-fueled celebration at the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom, where 400 of Manhattan's wealthiest elite had gathered to witness what they believed would be the crowning achievement of Alexandra's career, but what David recognized from 20 feet away as the most sophisticated assassination authorization he had encountered in 15 years of reviewing corporate contracts. At 45, David possessed the kind of invisible legal expertise that characterized former elite attorneys whose careers had been destroyed by personal tragedy rather than professional incompetence. His eyes still automatically scanned contract structures for hidden provisions, his mind still processed merger language for embedded threats. But his heart had learned that no professional achievement mattered compared to being present for the 13-year-old daughter who had already lost her mother to his workaholic priorities. But the contract positioned on the signing table before Alexandra contained linguistic patterns that David's expertise made impossible to ignore. The specific phrase structure in the section headers, the unusual pagination that suggested inserted provisions, the way certain definitions had been positioned across page breaks to obscure their complete meaning, all indicating that someone with advanced legal training had deliberately weaponized standard merger language into something far more dangerous. "Excuse me," Alexandra said, her ice-blue eyes flashing with irritation as she turned toward the black custodial worker who had dared to interrupt the most important moment of her professional life with what seemed like completely inappropriate interference from someone whose job responsibilities involved cleaning champagne spills rather than commenting on billion-dollar corporate transactions. At 37, Alexandra Sterling possessed the striking blonde beauty and inherited pharmaceutical empire that had enabled her to maintain control of Sterling Pharmaceuticals through 7 years of aggressive market expansion, though her success had required developing the kind of interpersonal distance that made unexpected warnings from service workers seem like either delusion or deliberate disruption rather than potentially life-saving expertise. "Ma'am, before you sign that contract, you need to check page 47, David continued, his voice carrying the controlled urgency he had once used when advising Fortune 500 CEOs about hidden liability provisions that could destroy their companies. There's language in that section that doesn't match standard merger protocols." The warning should have been dismissed. Wealthy CEOs didn't take contract advice from custodial staff, particularly not during public signing ceremonies where hundreds of witnesses expected smooth execution rather than last-minute interference from invisible employees whose expertise seemed impossible given their current employment status. But something in David's voice, the precise legal terminology, the specific page reference, the controlled authority that suggested professional training rather than delusional interference, made Alexandra pause with the pen millimeters from the signature line that would transfer $8 billion and potentially authorize her own elimination. "Mr. Morrison, this isn't appropriate," said Thomas Bradley, Sterling Pharmaceutical's chief financial officer, his voice carrying the smooth authority that characterized executives skilled at neutralizing threats through social pressure rather than direct confrontation. "Security, please escort our custodial worker back to his duties." But Alexandra's hand had already moved to page 47, her executive instincts recognizing that David's warning contained too much specificity to be random interference, while her survival instincts processed the curious fact that Thomas seemed unusually eager to prevent her from reviewing the specific page that the janitor had referenced. The ballroom fell into expectant silence as Alexandra read the provision that David had flagged, her perfectly composed expression gradually transforming into something between confusion and horror as she processed language that seemed simultaneously standard and profoundly threatening. In the event of Chief Executive Officer incapacitation, death, or temporary medical emergency within 90-day post-merger integration period, all equity holdings, decision rights, and corporate control transfer automatically and irrevocably to designated successor per Appendix K, bypassing probate review, shareholder vote, or board approval. Incapacitation includes, but is not limited to, cardiovascular events, neurological episodes, accidental trauma, or any condition rendering CEO unable to perform duties for period exceeding 72 consecutive hours. This is standard succession planning language, Thomas interjected smoothly, recognizing that Alexandra had found the provision but not yet understanding its implications. Every major merger includes key person provisions to protect shareholder value during leadership transitions. Standard succession planning doesn't define temporary medical emergency to include cardiovascular events, David said quietly, his legal expertise making the provision's danger immediately obvious, despite Thomas's attempt to normalize obviously threatening language. And standard provisions don't create automatic, irrevocable transfer that bypasses all oversight mechanisms. That's assassination authorization disguised as corporate governance. The accusation hit the ballroom like detonation, not because guests immediately understood the legal technicalities, but because a black custodial worker had just used sophisticated M&A terminology to accuse the CFO of embedding murder provisions in a contract that the CEO was seconds away from signing before 400 witnesses, whose collective net worth exceeded small nations' GDP. Alexandra, who is this person? Asked board member Catherine Walsh, her voice carrying the controlled alarm that characterized directors processing unexpected disruption during critical corporate events. And why are we allowing custodial staff to interrupt merger proceedings with conspiracy theories about contract language? Ms. Walsh, I'm someone who spent 15 years reviewing merger contracts for Kirkland and Ellis before circumstances made it necessary to accept different employment, David replied, providing credentials that transformed him from delusional janitor into potentially credible expert whose warning deserved consideration rather than immediate dismissal. The revelation that Sterling Pharmaceutical's night custodian was formerly an elite M&A attorney at one of the world's most prestigious law firms created ripple of recognition through the crowd. Kirkland and Ellis did not hire mediocre lawyers, and their M&A specialists represented the absolute pinnacle of corporate contract expertise that commanded fees exceeding most people's annual salaries for single document reviews. Mr. Morrison, if you have relevant expertise, please explain specifically what concerns you about this provision, Alexandra said, her executive decision-making overriding social discomfort about taking advice from custodial workers when her survival instincts recognized that David's warning contained too much technical precision to be paranoid fantasy. The provision combines three elements that individually seem benign, but together create legal assassination authorization, David explained, his voice carrying the methodical clarity that elite attorneys learned for explaining complex concepts during high-stakes negotiations. First, it defines incapacitation broadly enough to include any medical event. Second, it creates automatic, irrevocable transfer without oversight. Third, it references Appendix K for successor designation without requiring that appendix to be disclosed during signing. Check Appendix K, David continued, his expertise making the trap obvious, despite its sophisticated construction. I guarantee it designates Thomas Bradley as automatic successor, and I guarantee the definition of incapacitation has been carefully crafted to include medical conditions that can be artificially induced to appear natural. As Alexandra flipped to Appendix K, with hands that had begun trembling slightly, the ballroom silence transformed from expectant to horrified, as 400 of Manhattan's wealthiest processed that they were potentially witnessing not a merger celebration, but the interruption of a sophisticated murder plot embedded in contract language that most attorneys wouldn't recognize as threatening. Appendix K designates Thomas Bradley as successor, Alexandra read aloud, her voice carrying shock that was transforming into recognition of betrayal. And it includes specific reference to cardiovascular events and neurological episodes, conditions that my family medical history makes me particularly vulnerable to experiencing, information that only my closest advisors would know. Alexandra, this is absurd, Thomas protested, though his defensive tone suggested growing awareness that his carefully constructed plan was unraveling because a custodial worker possessed expertise that his background check had somehow missed. You're allowing a disgruntled former attorney to sabotage our merger with paranoid conspiracy theories about standard corporate language. Standard corporate language doesn't create 90-day windows for convenient CEO elimination, David replied, his voice carrying controlled anger about recognizing assassination provisions that represented sophisticated evolution of techniques he had once used to protect companies rather than threaten their leaders. And standard provisions don't include the specific medical conditions that Ms. Sterling's family history makes statistically likely. That's targeted murder authorization based on insider medical knowledge. As security guards approached to remove David, while Alexandra demanded explanation from Thomas, whose smooth confidence was fracturing under unexpected scrutiny. The viral moment that would ultimately expose systematic corporate assassination was crystallizing through the collision between invisible expertise and public crisis. Some discoveries about immediate danger require recognizing that the most sophisticated threats hide in plain sight, using language that seems mundane until expertise reveals the weapons concealed in standard provisions, and that protecting lives sometimes requires custodial workers to risk employment by interrupting billion-dollar celebrations with warnings that sound impossible until CEOs check page 47 and discover their signatures would authorize their own murders within 90 days. The investigation that would force David Morrison to confront the most devastating failure of his professional and personal life began at 2:17 a.m. in Alexandra Sterling's private office, 5 hours after security had escorted him from the gala, while she demanded forensic legal review of the contract that David had prevented her from signing before 400 witnesses whose shocked reactions were already generating viral social media coverage about assassination provisions hidden in corporate mergers. Mr. Morrison, I need to understand how a Kirkland & Ellis M&A attorney ended up working as custodial staff at the company whose merger contract you just prevented me from signing, Alexandra said, her voice carrying the analytical intensity that successful CEOs brought to evaluating information that challenged fundamental assumptions about corporate security and employee background screening. David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any inquiry into the 5 years between his prestigious legal career and his current invisible employment, uncertain whether Alexandra's investigation would reveal just his professional downfall or the complete tragedy that had transformed elite attorney into custodial worker whose expertise remained intact, but whose capacity for practicing law had been destroyed by guilt that no amount of therapy could eliminate. Ms. Sterling, my transition out of corporate law involved circumstances that made it impossible to continue practicing, despite maintaining the expertise that allowed me to recognize the threat in your contract. David replied, using careful language that acknowledged his qualifications without providing details about personal catastrophe and professional dissolution. Mr. Morrison, I spent the past 3 hours having my security team investigate your background, Alexandra said, settling into her desk chair with materials that suggested comprehensive research rather than casual curiosity. You weren't just any Kirkland and Ellis attorney, you were their youngest partner, specializing in pharmaceutical mergers, with reputation for identifying hidden liability provisions that other lawyers missed. Indeed, the recognition was both validating and devastating, confirming that Alexandra now understood his qualifications while inevitably leading to questions about why someone with his expertise and achievements had disappeared from corporate law to work in custodial services at the same pharmaceutical company, where his specialty would have commanded 7-figure consulting fees. Yes, ma'am, that's accurate, David acknowledged. But I also need you to understand that my ability to recognize assassination provisions in your contract comes from extremely painful personal experience with how pharmaceutical mergers can hide systematic harm behind legal language that seems protective. What kind of personal experience ends the career of a top pharmaceutical merger attorney? Alexandra asked, her tone carrying genuine concern rather than judgmental curiosity, suggesting she was seeking understanding rather than ammunition for dismissing his warnings as bias. The question required David to revisit the period that had destroyed both his professional identity and his family structure, the 6 months when his obsessive focus on completing a major pharmaceutical merger had made him miss that his wife Rebecca was dying from the experimental Sterling Pharmaceuticals drug, whose adverse effects had been deliberately hidden in the merger documents he was too busy reviewing to notice were killing the person he loved most. 5 years ago, my wife Rebecca was enrolled in a Sterling Pharmaceuticals clinical trial for an experimental breast cancer treatment, David said, his voice carrying controlled emotion about circumstances that therapy had helped him discuss without completely breaking down. She died from liver failure caused by drug toxicity that your company's research had identified, but deliberately suppressed during a merger acquisition that I was hired to facilitate. Alexandra's expression shifted from business interrogation to human recognition of genuine tragedy, understanding that she was confronting someone whose expertise came from the most painful kind of personal experience rather than just professional training in pharmaceutical contract review. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry that happened to your wife, but I need to understand the connection between her death and your current employment, Alexandra said, using business-like directness that acknowledged his loss while seeking information that could explain his transformation from elite attorney to custodial worker. The connection is that I was so consumed with reviewing merger documents for the acquisition that was suppressing Rebecca's drug safety data that I missed obvious signs she was dying, David replied, his honesty about professional failure both personally vulnerable and ethically necessary for explaining his current circumstances. She would tell me she felt sick, and I would say the doctors are monitoring you, while I worked until 3 a.m. reviewing Appendix K provisions for corporate liability protection. She would show me how her skin was turning yellow, and I would say, that's normal for chemotherapy, while I drafted succession planning language almost identical to what I just prevented you from signing. The admission revealed how completely his professional success had been built on priorities that had killed his wife, while he crafted the exact legal structures that were now being used to threaten Alexandra's life, creating expertise that was both invaluable for prevention and psychologically unbearable to utilize because it represented his greatest personal failure. Rebecca died at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, while I was in the office completing final review of the merger contract that had buried the adverse effects data that would have warned her doctors that the drug was killing her, David continued, providing details that made abstract tragedy into specific moral failure. I found her body when I came home at 6:15 a.m. to shower before an 8 a.m. signing ceremony where I would help complete the acquisition that had suppressed the evidence that could have saved her life. Has David explained how Rebecca's death had destroyed both his marriage to his career and his relationship with his daughter Amara, who had been 8 years old when her mother died, and her father had been too consumed with work to notice either crisis. Alexandra began understanding that his warning about page 47 represented not just technical expertise, but personal experience with how pharmaceutical mergers weaponized legal language to hide systematic harm. After Rebecca's funeral, I tried to continue practicing law, David said, but every merger contract I reviewed reminded me of the provisions I had missed while my wife died. Every pharmaceutical client meeting made me see Rebecca's yellow skin and my dismissive responses about normal side effects. Every late night at the office made me remember that I had prioritized corporate liability protection over noticing that the person I loved most was being killed by drugs whose dangers I was helping to conceal. So I quit Kirkland & Ellis, filed for bankruptcy to pay Rebecca's medical bills that our insurance didn't cover, and accepted custodial work that would never require me to review another merger contract or miss another moment of Amara's childhood because I was too busy protecting pharmaceutical companies from liability for drugs that killed patients. Donate, the explanation revealed why someone with elite legal training had chosen invisible service work rather than leveraging his expertise for lucrative consulting. David's career change had been protective boundary rather than professional failure, choosing presence for his surviving child over expertise that represented his most devastating personal failure. But Mr. Morrison, if reviewing merger contracts is traumatic for you, why did you intervene tonight? Alexandra asked, her question reflecting genuine confusion about why someone who had deliberately escaped corporate law would risk psychological harm by flagging provisions in her merger document. Because, when I saw page 47, I recognized language structure almost identical to provisions I had drafted years ago to protect pharmaceutical companies during leadership transitions. David replied, his voice carrying the exhaustion that characterized people whose expertise made them unable to ignore threats, even when intervention required confronting trauma they had spent years trying to escape. Those provisions were designed to ensure corporate stability if CEOs died naturally during mergers. Someone with advanced legal training took my protective language and weaponized it into assassination authorization by adding medical definitions broad enough to include induced conditions and succession mechanisms that bypass all oversight. It's like watching someone turn my work into a murder weapon. As their conversation continued through early morning hours, while Alexandra's legal team conducted independent review that confirmed David's assessment about the contract's embedded threats, both participants understood that preventing her assassination would require David to re-enter the corporate legal world that represented his greatest professional expertise and his most profound personal trauma. Mr. Morrison, I need to hire you as special legal counsel to review our entire merger portfolio for similar provisions, Alexandra said, making the offer that would either save her life or destroy David's carefully maintained boundaries between his expertise and his family obligations. I can't trust my current legal team if someone managed to embed assassination provisions without detection. Ms. Sterling, accepting that position means spending extensive time reviewing contracts instead of being present for Amara, recreating exactly the work-life imbalance that killed my wife and nearly destroyed my relationship with my daughter, David replied, his honesty about personal costs acknowledging that her survival might require sacrificing his family's stability. Some moral choices require understanding that expertise gained through devastating personal failure can become ethical obligation when that knowledge could prevent others from experiencing similar tragedy, even when utilizing that expertise requires confronting trauma and recreating exactly the professional priorities that destroyed your family while potentially saving someone whose company's drugs killed the person you loved most. 3 weeks after David had accepted Alexandra's offer to serve as temporary special legal counsel, reviewing Sterling Pharmaceutical's complete merger portfolio for embedded assassination provisions, he found himself working 16-hour days in a corner office that felt like returning to a crime scene where he had murdered his marriage through professional obsession. Except this time, his 13-year-old daughter Amara was watching him disappear into the same work patterns that had killed her mother, while he had been too consumed with contracts to notice. "Dad, it's 11:47 p.m. and you're still not home," Amara said through the phone call that interrupted David's analysis of a 680-page acquisition contract whose Appendix L contained language suspiciously similar to the provisions he had flagged in Alexandra's document. "You said this was temporary. You said you wouldn't become the person who missed Mom dying because work was more important." The accusation hit David like physical violence, not because it was inaccurate, but because his daughter's voice carried the same mixture of disappointment and resignation that Rebecca had used during their final months together when she had stopped expecting him to come home for dinner or noticed that her skin was turning yellow while he drafted liability protection for the drugs that were killing her. "Baby, I know I promised, but Alexandra found 17 more contracts with similar provisions," David replied, using the rationalization that had characterized every broken promise during his Kirkland and Ellis years. "If I don't review them all, someone could die the way these clauses were designed to make deaths appear natural." "Someone is dying, Dad," Amara said with 13-year-old directness that cut through adult justification like surgical precision. "I'm watching you die the same way Mom did, slowly disappearing into work that matters more than the people who love you, until one day you'll be gone, even if you're still breathing." The parallel was both accurate and devastating, forcing David to confront that his heroic effort to save Alexandra was recreating exactly the priorities that had destroyed his family, teaching his daughter that strangers' potential deaths mattered more than her concrete need for a parent who stayed present instead of disappearing into professional obligations that felt urgent precisely because they allowed avoiding the harder work of being emotionally available. Meanwhile, Alexandra Sterling was experiencing her own crisis as the forensic legal review had revealed that Thomas Bradley's assassination authorization wasn't isolated criminality, but systematic conspiracy involving 7 board members whose financial incentives aligned with her elimination, creating institutional resistance to investigation that threatened not just her physical survival, but her ability to maintain corporate control while exposing conspiracy that extended throughout her executive leadership. "Alexandra, the board is demanding your resignation, citing erratic behavior and paranoid accusations against respected executives," reported her executive assistant Patricia Morrison during their emergency strategy meeting. "Thomas has convinced 6 other board members that your claims about assassination provisions represent mental instability that makes you unfit for leadership." "Patricia, we have forensic evidence of embedded murder authorizations in 17 merger contracts," Alexandra replied, though her defensive tone revealed growing awareness that institutional power could dismiss documented evidence when accepting truth threatened too many powerful people's interests and financial positions. "But Alexandra, that evidence was identified by a custodial worker whose background includes bankruptcy and career collapse after his wife's death," Patricia continued, using the institutional logic that discredited truth by attacking messengers whose circumstances made their expertise seem impossible or their motivations suspect. The board pressure was both legally sophisticated and personally threatening, transforming David's warnings from life-saving intervention into evidence of Alexandra's supposed instability, while positioning Thomas's conspiracy as protective governance against CEO, whose paranoia endangered shareholder value. As both David and Alexandra faced institutional resistance to exposing conspiracy, while their collaboration extracted escalating personal costs, 13-year-old Amara Morrison was conducting her own investigation using skills that neither adult had known she possessed. Advanced hacking capabilities developed through online communities where she had been secretly seeking evidence about her mother's death for 5 years. "Dad, I need to show you something," Amara said when David finally arrived home at 1:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning, her teenage determination overriding her anger about his continued absence. "I've been accessing Sterling Pharmaceutical's internal communications for 2 years, and Thomas Bradley's emails reference Mom specifically." "Amara, please tell me you didn't hack into a pharmaceutical company's secure networks," David replied, his voice carrying both concern about federal computer crimes and recognition that his daughter possessed capabilities that could either expose the conspiracy or result in her prosecution for unauthorized system access. "Dad, Thomas Bradley sent emails describing Mom's clinical trial as test case for induced organic failure methodology," Amara continued, ignoring his concerns while providing evidence that transformed Rebecca's death from tragic pharmaceutical negligence into deliberate murder that had been experimental preparation for Thomas's planned elimination of Alexandra. The revelation meant that Rebecca hadn't died from random adverse effects, but from intentional overdosing designed to perfect assassination techniques that appeared natural. Her death had been rehearsal for the murder plot that David had interrupted by warning Alexandra about page 47, making his wife's suffering into proof of concept for systematic corporate assassination. He killed Mom deliberately to test whether pharmaceutical overdoses could be ruled natural complications, Amara said, her 13-year-old voice breaking as she processed that her mother's death hadn't been tragic accident, but premeditated murder disguised as clinical trial complications. And now he's trying to do the same thing to Ms. Sterling, using the methods he perfected on Mom. As David processed that his professional failure to protect Rebecca had been compounded by the fact that her death had been intentional murder, rather than the negligence he had been blaming himself for during 5 years of therapy and self-recrimination, the psychological complexity of his situation transformed from guilt about missing warning signs to rage about conspiracy that had weaponized his workaholic absence to murder his wife while testing techniques for future eliminations. "Amara, if what you're saying is accurate, we need to involve federal authorities immediately," David said, his legal training providing framework for understanding that Rebecca's murder and Thomas's conspiracy represented federal crimes requiring FBI investigation rather than just corporate internal review. "But Dad, I obtained this evidence through illegal hacking that could result in my prosecution," Amara replied, her teenage understanding of legal systems recognizing that exposing conspiracy often endangered the whistleblowers whose methods didn't match approved procedures for evidence collection. The dilemma revealed how systematic institutional corruption often protected itself by making the evidence necessary for prosecution inadmissible through legal technicalities that prioritized proper procedures over substantive truth. Amara's hacking could prove conspiracy, but also result in her prosecution for computer crimes that carried sentences exceeding what Thomas might face for murder. Over the following days, as David worked with Alexandra's diminishing legal team to document conspiracy, while Thomas consolidated board support for Alexandra's removal, and Amara continued hacking to gather evidence that could either expose systematic murder or result in her federal prosecution, all participants understood that protecting both Alexandra's life and Amara's freedom required legal strategy that could utilize illegally obtained evidence while protecting the source, whose age made her particularly vulnerable to aggressive prosecution. David, I need you to understand that using Amara's evidence could expose her to charges that would destroy her future, Alexandra said during one of their late-night strategy sessions, her voice carrying executive responsibility about recognizing that saving her own life shouldn't require sacrificing a child's well-being. We need to find legal pathway that protects both truth and your daughter. Alexandra, Amara spent 5 years secretly investigating her mother's death because I was too consumed with guilt to pursue justice, David replied, his honesty about parental failure acknowledging that his daughter's illegal hacking represented an attempt to complete the investigation that his emotional collapse had abandoned. She's 13 years old, conducting federal investigation that FBI should have initiated if anyone had questioned whether Rebecca's death was truly accidental. Using her evidence means potentially prosecuting a child for doing the work that institutional systems failed to perform. Some sacrifices require understanding that exposing systematic conspiracy often endangers the people whose courage makes truth visible, and that protecting children sometimes means choosing between their immediate safety and the justice they've been seeking through methods that legal systems will punish, despite the moral necessity that motivated their actions. 6 weeks after Amara's hacking had revealed that Thomas Bradley's conspiracy included 12 test patients, whose deaths had been deliberately induced to perfect pharmaceutical assassination techniques that appeared natural, attorney Margaret Chen arrived at David's temporary Sterling office, carrying evidence that would either exonerate his daughter's illegal investigation or destroy both their efforts to expose systematic murder through corporate merger contracts. David, I need to confess something that might change everything about how we approach this case, Margaret said, her voice carrying the controlled anxiety that characterized attorneys about to reveal they had been unknowingly complicit in crimes they were now trying to expose. I drafted every single assassination provision in the contracts you've been reviewing, and I did it without understanding what I was creating. David looked up from forensic analysis with the focused attention that elite attorneys brought to processing information that could either solve impossible legal problems or reveal that their allies had been participating in conspiracy. Margaret Chen was Sterling's general counsel, whose reputation for meticulous contract drafting made her either the conspiracy's architect or its most sophisticated victim. Margaret, are you telling me that you knowingly embedded murder authorizations in 17 merger contracts? David asked, his voice carrying both hope that she was victim and concern that she was perpetrator whose confession represented strategic manipulation rather than genuine revelation. I'm telling you that Thomas gave me contract provisions piecemeal over 18 months, individual clauses about succession planning, medical emergency protocols, insurance beneficiary designations, liability limitations. That seemed standard when reviewed separately, but which you've now shown me combine into systematic assassination authorization, Margaret replied, providing explanation that transformed her from criminal mastermind into professional victim of sophisticated manipulation. The confession meant that Thomas's conspiracy had been constructed through compartmentalized drafting that prevented even experienced attorneys from recognizing how individual provisions combined into murder weapons. Margaret had been creating assassination manual without understanding the document's ultimate purpose because she never saw all pieces assembled simultaneously. Show me the emails where Thomas requested these provisions, David said, his prosecutorial instincts recognizing that Margaret's communications could provide evidence of Thomas's systematic manipulation while potentially protecting her from conspiracy charges if her participation had been unknowing rather than deliberate. Over the following hours, Margaret presented email chains revealing Thomas's sophisticated legal strategy. He had requested contract provisions using legitimate business justifications that obscured their ultimate purpose when combined, creating paper trail that appeared to show routine corporate governance rather than premeditated murder planning. This email from March 2019 shows Thomas requesting standard key person provisions for merger stability, Margaret explained, displaying communications that demonstrated how sophisticated criminals used mundane language to create extraordinary harm. This one from June 2019 requests medical emergency protocols, matching industry standards. Each request seemed routine, but together they created assassination authorization. Margaret, this evidence proves you were manipulated rather than complicit, David assessed, his legal expertise recognizing that her emails demonstrated reasonable attorney behavior rather than knowing participation in conspiracy. But it also means we need your testimony to prove Thomas's systematic deception. Indeed, the alliance expanded as Margaret agreed to cooperate, while understanding that her testimony could either exonerate her professional reputation or destroy her career, depending on whether prosecutors believed her participation had been unknowing or whether her supposed ignorance seemed implausible for someone with her expertise. Meanwhile, Alexandra was discovering that FBI investigation into Thomas's conspiracy had been complicated by the fact that Amara's hacking, while revealing crucial evidence, had violated multiple federal computer crime statutes that made her prosecution technically mandatory, regardless of the moral justification for her unauthorized access to corporate systems. Ms. Sterling, we need to discuss the source of your evidence about Mr. Bradley's conspiracy, said FBI Special Agent Robert Martinez during their formal interview about Thomas's assassination planning. The digital forensics suggest sophisticated, unauthorized access that would constitute federal crimes. Agent Martinez, the evidence was provided by a 13-year-old girl whose mother was murdered as test case for the conspiracy we're trying to expose, Alexandra replied, using emotional framing that positioned Amara as victim rather than criminal, despite her technical violations of computer access laws. Ms. Sterling, the law doesn't exempt minors from prosecution for computer crimes simply because their motivations were sympathetic, Martinez continued, using federal logic that treated illegal hacking as prosecutable, regardless of whether the accessed information revealed systematic murder or corporate fraud. The legal complexity meant that exposing Thomas's conspiracy required either accepting Amara's prosecution for providing evidence or finding alternative pathway that could utilize her discoveries while protecting her from charges that technically violated federal statutes despite moral necessity. As their alliance developed through Margaret's testimony about manipulation and Alexandra's negotiation with FBI about protecting Amara while prosecuting Thomas, all participants understood that exposing systematic conspiracy often required collaborative legal strategy that could transform illegally obtained evidence into admissible testimony through proper investigative procedures. David, I have a proposal that could protect Amara while utilizing her evidence, Agent Martinez offered during their strategy meeting. If she cooperates with supervised FBI investigation that replicates her unauthorized access through proper warrant procedures, we could grant immunity for her prior hacking while using her technical expertise to gather admissible evidence. You're suggesting that my 13-year-old daughter work with FBI to hack Sterling Pharmaceuticals under federal supervision? David asked, processing both relief that prosecution could be avoided and concern about involving Amara more deeply in an investigation that had already consumed his time and threatened their relationship. I'm suggesting that we legitimize her technical capabilities through proper legal channels while protecting her from prosecution for actions that were morally justified but technically illegal, Martinez clarified, providing framework for transforming Amara from criminal hacker into cooperating witness whose skills could benefit federal investigation. The proposal represented evolution from crisis response to systematic prosecution strategy, where Amara's illegal investigation could become foundation for federal case that protected her while exposing Thomas's conspiracy through evidence gathered under proper warrant authority. Over the following weeks, as Amara worked with FBI Cybercrimes Unit to replicate her unauthorized access through legal procedures, while Margaret provided testimony about Thomas's manipulation and Alexandra maintained corporate control despite board pressure for her removal, all participants understood that exposing conspiracy required collaborative expertise that included former elite attorneys' contract knowledge, general counsel's testimony about manipulation, CEO's institutional access, and teenage hackers' technical capabilities. What we're building, Agent Martinez announced during their coordination meeting, is federal case that combines Margaret's testimony about manipulation, Amara's technical evidence gathered under warrant authority, David's expertise about contract provisions, and Alexandra's cooperation about corporate conspiracy, creating prosecution that addresses both Thomas's murder planning and the systematic institutional failures that made his conspiracy possible. Some alliances require understanding that exposing sophisticated conspiracy often requires combining diverse expertise through collaborative investigation, and that protecting child witnesses sometimes means legitimizing their capabilities through proper procedures, while acknowledging that their initial illegal actions were morally justified responses to institutional systems that had failed to investigate obvious crimes. The crisis that would determine whether Thomas Bradley faced prosecution for systematic murder or successfully eliminated both Alexandra Sterling and the evidence against him reached its breaking point when the board's emergency vote to remove Alexandra from CEO position was scheduled for the same day that FBI planned to execute arrest warrants, creating a 12-hour window where Thomas's desperation would either expose his conspiracy through premature action or succeed in consolidating power that could bury evidence permanently. Alexandra, the board vote is scheduled for 2 p.m. today, and Thomas has convinced 8 of 12 directors that your continued leadership represents existential threat to shareholder value, reported Patricia Morrison during their emergency morning briefing at 6:47 a.m. If they remove you before FBI arrests him, he assumes CEO authority with legal power to obstruct federal investigation and destroy evidence. The tactical assessment meant that Thomas's conspiracy had evolved from hidden assassination planning to open corporate coup, using board governance procedures to eliminate Alexandra before law enforcement could prevent his assumption of power that would make evidence destruction legally defensible as corporate document management. Patricia, FBI arrest warrants are sealed until 3 p.m. execution, Alexandra replied, her voice carrying controlled fury about recognizing that 12 hours could determine whether systematic murder was exposed or permanently concealed. We need to delay the board vote until federal agents can arrest Thomas before he consolidates legal authority to obstruct investigation. But Alexandra, the board has legal authority to hold emergency votes regardless of CEO preferences, and any attempt to prevent legitimate governance procedures could be used as additional evidence of your supposed instability. Patricia explained, revealing how institutional processes designed for corporate stability could be weaponized by conspirators whose control of board majority made democratic procedures into tools for consolidating criminal power. Meanwhile, David Morrison was experiencing his own confrontation as Thomas's legal team had filed emergency custody motion suggesting that David's obsessive work schedule and involvement of 13-year-old Amara in federal investigation constituted child endangerment that required immediate intervention, using family court procedures to eliminate David's ability to provide expert testimony while traumatizing Amara through suggestion that her father's priorities were recreating exactly the neglect that had killed her mother. Mr. Morrison, the custody motion alleges that your daughter is being exploited for federal investigation while you work 16-hour days neglecting her supervision and emotional needs, said family court attorney Jennifer Torres during their emergency consultation. Thomas Bradley has provided declarations from teachers reporting that Amara appears exhausted and distracted, suggesting parental neglect related to your work obligations. Ms. Torres, my daughter is exhausted because she's been voluntarily assisting FBI investigation into conspiracy that murdered her mother, David replied, his voice carrying controlled rage about recognizing that Thomas was using family court to punish Amara for providing evidence while positioning David's work commitment as parental failure rather than pursuit of justice. But Mr. Morrison, the court doesn't distinguish between work, neglect, and justice-motivated absence. If you're unavailable for parenting because you're obsessed with exposing conspiracy, that creates same harm as your previous workaholic patterns that contributed to your wife's death, Torres explained, using legal logic that treated David's current investigation as recreation of the professional obsession that had destroyed his family. The custody threat was both legally sophisticated and emotionally devastating, exploiting David's deepest guilt about Rebecca's death to suggest that his pursuit of justice was just another form of the work addiction that had killed her while he had been too consumed with contracts to notice she was dying. As both Alexandra and David faced institutional procedures designed to eliminate them before FBI could execute arrests, 13-year-old Amara Morrison was conducting her own final investigation. Unauthorized access to Thomas's personal encrypted communications that would either provide smoking gun evidence of premeditated conspiracy or result in her federal prosecution for violations that FBI supervision couldn't legitimize because she was acting without warrant authority. Dad, I found Thomas's communications with the actual assassin, Amara announced during their emergency call at 11:23 a.m., her teenage voice carrying both triumph and awareness that she had just committed federal crimes that her previous immunity agreement didn't cover. He's planning to trigger Alexandra's cardiovascular event today during the board meeting. He has someone positioned to introduce pharmaceutical agents into her coffee that will cause heart attack that appears natural. Amara, please tell me you obtained this through FBI-supervised access, David replied, though her silence confirmed that his daughter had violated her immunity agreement to gather evidence that could save Alexandra's life while potentially destroying her own future through federal prosecution for unauthorized hacking. Dad, FBI warrant procedures take hours, and Alexandra drinks coffee at 1:45 p.m. before every board meeting, Amara explained, her 13-year-old logic prioritizing immediate life-saving over legal compliance. I could wait for proper procedures and watch her die, or I could hack Thomas's communications illegally and save her life. I chose saving her life. The revelation meant that Amara had sacrificed her immunity agreement and federal protection to gather evidence that could prevent Alexandra's murder, but would also result in her prosecution for computer crimes that her age made particularly serious because minors who demonstrated sophisticated hacking capabilities were often prosecuted as adults to deter youth cybercrime. Amara, You just traded your future to save someone you barely know, David said, his voice breaking as he processed that his daughter had made exactly the kind of sacrifice that characterized people whose moral clarity exceeded their understanding of legal consequences. Dad, I traded my immunity to save someone whose life matters, the same way you've been trading our time together to expose the conspiracy that killed Mom, Amara replied, her observation revealing that she had internalized her father's priorities about justice and sacrifice even when those values created costs that neither of them had fully anticipated. As emergency timelines converged, board vote at 2 p.m., FBI arrests at 3 p.m., Alexandra's coffee at 1:45 p.m., Thomas's assassin positioned and ready, all participants understood that preventing murder would require choosing between legal procedures that protected Amara and immediate action that could save Alexandra while destroying the immunity agreement that was supposed to protect a child whose hacking had exposed systematic conspiracy. Agent Martinez, Amara has evidence that Thomas plans to poison Alexandra during today's board meeting, David reported during their emergency call, but she obtained it through unauthorized access that violates her immunity agreement. Mr. Morrison, if Amara violated immunity terms, I can't protect her from prosecution regardless of whether her evidence saves Miss Sterling's life, Martinez replied, his federal authority constrained by legal procedures that treated evidence-gathering methods as equally important as the lives those methods could save. But Agent Martinez, my daughter is 13 years old who hacked to prevent murder. Prosecuting her sends message that children who expose conspiracy should have waited for proper procedures, even if waiting means watching people die, David argued, his desperation revealing how completely the legal system's priorities about procedures could conflict with moral necessity during time-sensitive crisis. The confrontation reached its peak as Alexandra prepared for board meeting. While unaware that her 1:45 p.m. coffee would be poisoned, David raced to warn her while knowing that using Amara's evidence would expose his daughter to prosecution, and Thomas positioned his assassin while confident that institutional procedures would either eliminate Alexandra through board vote or through cardiovascular event that would appear natural to everyone except the federal investigators whose arrest warrants would become moot once he assumed CEO authority. Alexandra, don't drink the coffee, David announced as he burst into the boardroom at 1:44 p.m., his dramatic entrance stopping her hand halfway to the cup that Thomas's assistant had prepared with pharmaceutical agents designed to trigger fatal heart attack within minutes. David, what are you... Alexandra began, but her question was interrupted by David knocking the coffee cup from the table, spilling liquid that forensic analysis would later confirm contained fatal concentration of cardiac glycosides that would have killed her before FBI could execute arrest warrants. Thomas Bradley has positioned an assassin to poison your coffee with compounds that trigger cardiovascular events, matching your family medical history, David explained, his accusation delivered before 12 board members whose reactions would determine whether they saw him as protective expert or delusional conspiracy theorist, whose dramatic intervention justified Alexandra's removal. This is insane, Thomas protested, though his defensive tone and the sudden paleness of his executive assistant suggested that David's intervention had disrupted carefully planned execution that was supposed to appear like natural medical emergency rather than deliberate murder. Some confrontations require understanding that preventing murder sometimes means violating legal procedures that prioritize proper evidence gathering over immediate life-saving, and that protecting children who expose conspiracy often requires accepting that their illegal methods were morally necessary responses to institutional systems whose proper procedures would have resulted in additional deaths. 20 months after Thomas Bradley had been sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murders of Rebecca Morrison and 11 other test patients whose deaths had perfected assassination techniques that appeared natural, while federal investigation had exposed systematic conspiracy involving pharmaceutical mergers and contract-based murder authorizations across multiple corporations. David Morrison stood in the modest law office he had opened, not returning to elite practice, but creating Morrison Protective Contracts, a boutique firm specializing in reviewing corporate agreements for hidden assassination provisions and embedded harm. The office was deliberately small, 3 attorneys, including himself, maximum 20 clients per year, strict 6 p.m. closure policy that was posted prominently on the door, alongside photograph of Rebecca and Amara with caption reading, "The only contract that matters is the promise to be present for the people who need you most." At 47, David possessed integrated professional identity that characterized people who had transformed catastrophic failure into focused purpose. His expertise was still exceptional, but his priorities had been permanently reordered through recognition that preventing others from experiencing his tragedy required maintaining the family bonds that his previous workaholic patterns had nearly destroyed. Mr. Morrison, the pharmaceutical merger you reviewed, contained 14 embedded harm provisions that our legal team had missed, reported client CEO Jennifer Martinez during their follow-up consultation. Your analysis prevented what would have been our 3rd executive death in 5 years that we had attributed to stress-related medical conditions. Ms. Martinez, what I've learned through painful experience is that the most dangerous contracts are those that make harm appear natural, David replied, using language that honored both his professional expertise and the personal costs that had made that knowledge accessible. Thomas Bradley's conspiracy succeeded for years because he understood that sophisticated assassination doesn't look like murder. It looks like unfortunate medical events that no one questions until someone recognizes the patterns. Meanwhile, Alexandra Sterling was experiencing her own continued evolution as her leadership of Sterling Pharmaceuticals had survived board challenge and federal investigation to become model for ethical pharmaceutical development. But more importantly, she had transformed her relationship with corporate governance through recognition that her near death had resulted from isolation that made her vulnerable to conspiracy she should have detected if institutional culture had valued transparency over hierarchy. Alexandra, the Morrison protocols have now been adopted by 63 pharmaceutical companies and have identified 47 potentially harmful contract provisions in pending mergers, reported Chief Ethics Officer Margaret Chen during their quarterly review of institutional reforms that had emerged from Thomas's prosecution. Additionally, the Rebecca Morrison Memorial Scholarship has funded medical training for 32 students from families affected by unethical clinical trials, creating pipeline of physicians whose personal experience with pharmaceutical harm makes them advocates for patient safety rather than just corporate interests. At 39, Alexandra possessed earned authority that characterized leaders who had been transformed by their own near murder into advocates for systematic reform. Her pharmaceutical empire was still profitable, but she had learned to measure success through lives protected rather than just shareholder returns, understanding that her survival had created responsibility to prevent others from experiencing similar threats. As their professional collaboration continued through David's contract reviews and Alexandra's institutional reforms, both understood that preventing future conspiracies required sustained commitment to transparency and accountability rather than just prosecuting individual criminals whose methods would be replicated by others if corporate culture continued prioritizing profit over safety. Over the following months, 15-year-old Amara Morrison was completing her testimony before a congressional committee investigating corporate contract fraud. Her expertise in digital forensics having been legitimized through federal cooperation that transformed her from prosecuted hacker into protected witness whose technical capabilities had exposed systematic conspiracy. Members of Congress, what I learned through investigating my mother's death is that the most dangerous crimes are those that hide in corporate language that seems mundane until someone recognizes the weapons concealed in standard provisions, Amara testified, her teenage voice carrying authority that transcended her age through combination of technical expertise and personal experience with pharmaceutical murder. My illegal hacking exposed conspiracy that law enforcement systems had failed to investigate because institutional procedures prioritized proper evidence gathering over immediate life-saving. I'm not advocating for unauthorized computer access, but I am suggesting that our legal systems need reform when children must break laws to expose murders that adults with proper authority were too institutionally captured to prevent. The testimony reflected mature understanding of both legal necessity and moral complexity, acknowledging that her actions had been technically criminal, while arguing that systemic reform required addressing why proper procedures had been inadequate for preventing conspiracy that had murdered 13 people, while appearing to comply with all corporate governance requirements. 3 years after the gala where David had whispered, "Check page 47, he stood at Rebecca's grave with Amara, no longer alone in processing loss, but accompanied by Alexandra, Margaret, Agent Martinez, and 7 families whose loved ones' deaths had been exposed through investigation that Rebecca's murder had ultimately triggered. Rebecca, I don't know if preventing 47 assassination provisions makes up for missing that you were being murdered while I drafted contracts," David said to the gravestone that had been his companion through 5 years of grief and guilt. "But I think maybe you would understand that sometimes keeping our most important promises means using the expertise that our failures created, even when that expertise requires remembering everything we lost while we were too busy to notice what mattered most." Amara stood beside her father, no longer the 8-year-old who had lost her mother while her father worked late, but 15-year-old whose technical brilliance had saved lives while teaching her that justice sometimes required sacrifices that legal systems would punish, despite moral necessity that motivated them. "Dad, Mum's scholarship paid for my MIT early admission," Amara said, her teenage perspective providing connection between Rebecca's death and the educational opportunities that had emerged from exposing conspiracy. "So, in a way, the work you're doing to prevent other families from losing people isn't just about stopping murders. It's about creating futures for kids whose parents' deaths could have been prevented if anyone had been paying attention." Alexandra watched the father-daughter interaction with gratitude that transcended simple appreciation for David saving her life. She had learned through near death that wealth and power were worthless compared to relationships built on trust and mutual sacrifice, and that her survival created obligation to ensure that corporate systems protected rather than endangered the employees, whose expertise could prevent disasters if institutional culture valued knowledge over hierarchy. "David," Alexandra said as their memorial gathering concluded, "I want you to know that your expertise didn't just save my life. It taught me that the people we dismiss as invisible often possess knowledge that could save us if we had the humility to listen before crisis forces recognition. Alexandra, what I've learned is that expertise gained through devastating failure becomes obligation when that knowledge could prevent others from experiencing similar tragedy," David replied, using language that honored both professional capability and personal cost. "But I've also learned that preventing corporate murder requires maintaining the family bonds that make life worth protecting. Because saving strangers while losing your own children doesn't honor anyone's memory or create justice for families whose loved ones died while we were too busy to notice they needed help. 5 years after Rebecca's death, David and Amara had established routine that made their relationship the foundation rather than the casualty of his professional work. Dinner together every night at 6:30 p.m., weekend family time that was non-negotiable, annual scholarship ceremony in Rebecca's name where they met families whose children's medical education was funded by settlement money from Sterling Pharmaceutical's legal accountability for Thomas's conspiracy. Mr. Morrison, my daughter is becoming a physician because your wife's death exposed conspiracy that would have continued killing patients if you hadn't recognized the contract provisions that made assassination appear natural, said scholarship recipient Maria Santos during their annual ceremony. Rebecca's death saved my daughter's life by creating reform that protects patients from pharmaceutical harm. Some families are created through shared commitment to transforming personal tragedy into systematic reform that benefits communities rather than just processing private grief. And the most meaningful professional legacy often emerges from maintaining the promises we make to our children while using expertise that our failures created to prevent others from experiencing similar loss. Understanding that prevention requires presence as well as technical knowledge, and that the only contracts that ultimately matter are those written in love rather than legal language designed to hide systematic harm behind corporate governance procedures.